As I rode away from the home G and I shared for the past 3 years, my heart seemed to sink into my stomach. I refused to look back, afraid I would lose my nerve. At that night, my son and I slept over at my friend's house, and the early next morning, he put us on an aeroplane to LA. G's former manager Chuck had made arrangements for us to stay for a week at his apartment in Studio City, a suburb of LA. While he vacationed in Hawaii, Chuck had recently moved to LA and was now the head of the A&R for Dr. Dre's Aftermath Records. Chuck and I stayed in touch. Unbeknownst to G, he had been fully aware of the relationship troubles from the very beginning. He even stayed with me and G at our home for the first few months of the relationship. I was relieved to have somewhere else to go, even if only for a little while. Chuck was waiting at the baggage claim when Naeem and I arrived at Burbank Airport. I tried to make eye contact with him, yet he keeps sweeping over me with his eyes. Finally, I called his name, and as his eyes settled upon me, they became frozen in disbelief. He had not recognized me from my extremely thin 95-pound frame. My eyes were sunken in with dark circles around them, and my ribcage clearly showed through my clothes. I dove into his arms and began to cry with relief. Chuck soon got us settled in his apartment, making sure we had food to eat and that I was acquainted with the property, pool, laundry room and whatnot. The purpose for this week-long trip to LA was for me to collect my thoughts and get myself together. I had a lot to think about. There was custody and child support issues to figure out. I also needed to have a plan for my immediate future. I needed to find a way to buy a car or go to school so I could get a job and support myself for my son and I. I used that week in LA to recuperate in order to go back to Phoenix stronger. On one of my last nights in LA, Chuck saw to it that one of his friends took me out for a night on the town. I was feeling extremely awkward but still very excited to be going out. It was the first time that I would be introduced to the infamous Sunset Strip and the House of Blues. I remember walking around and the response of the men who walked past me. They would grab my arms, hands, and ask me to dance. I was flattered but still unsure of myself, so I would decline. The night was coming to a close and I began to search for Chuck's friends. During my search, I was stopped by yet another man who quickly announced himself as Marquise from the notorious 2 Live crew. We had a brief exchange and he wrote his phone number on a napkin, as I promised to call him the next day. I walked away, my eyes wandered about and soon became fixated on a man surrounded by women. He stood in the shadows and all I could make out was his fedora and the ringlets of hair which dangled from underneath it. He also carried a walking stick and from what I could tell was very well dressed in a well-tailored blue suit. I wonder who she's talking about. There was women clamouring around him, some who obviously he knew and many who wanted to know him. As he turned around, the ringlets bounced and the first step was a confident one, and that's when I realised I was staring at the rapper/actor Ice-T. I'm going to leave it here because I don't think As he turned around, his ringlets bounced and his first step was a confident one. That's when I realised I was staring at rapper Ice-T. Just then, I was tapped on the shoulder from behind by the guys I had come with and was told it was time to leave. With one last look at Ice-T, I reluctantly followed behind the guys. There was something about Ice that kept me thinking about him for the rest of the night. He exuded confidence and power, and even without speaking to him, I could tell he had it all together, and that being surrounded by all those women didn't excite him nearly as much as it excited them. He was used to it, and any one of those women would be better serviced by being with him, whereas he was already made and needed no woman to make him. I returned to Chuck's apartment that night, confident that I wanted to live in the city of lost angels. The next evening, I put in a call to Marquise, and we talked for about an hour.
Once he began to ask me about myself, I went on about all the things I had been through with G and how I had no idea what was to come back in Phoenix. All of a sudden, with a sense of urgency in his voice, he said, "There's somebody you should meet. I think he could help you. Let me see if I can find him and call you back." I waited nervously by the phone for about 20 minutes before it rang. Marquis said hello and then checked to see if his friend was on the other line. "Ice, you there?" Another voice chimed in. "Yeah, I'm here." Marquis continued, "Yzette, this is Ice-T. He's a good friend of mine. And I told him about you and your son and what you guys are going through right now. He can help you. Go ahead, Ice." Ice spoke to me for a few minutes and gave me his number. He said he didn't want to say much over the phone and that we should meet the following day. The next day, Chuck had returned from Hawaii to meet the moving trucks that would be taking him to a new house he had just purchased. And I was going to go to a hotel close to the airport since I'd be leaving the following morning. Once I checked into the hotel, I immediately called Ice and asked him to meet me there. Within an hour, he was at the door. I opened the door and let him in. It was sort of uncomfortable meeting him for the first time. I was nervous and hopeful that he would say or do something that would change the course of my life. He sat at the end of the bed as I sat at the adjacent desk, telling him my story from start to finish as my son crawled around playing on the floor. The look in his eyes softened more and more as I related the events of my life and relationship with G. I told him I was on my way back to Phoenix to tie up some loose ends and try to get an apartment and a job, but I decided to eventually move to Los Angeles. He told me his heart went out to me and my son, and that he had been very affected by my story when Marquis first told it to him, but was especially moved now. As he sat there watching my son and me together, he gave me some money, about $300, and said if I ever needed anything while in Phoenix, to be sure he was the first person I called. He also assured me that when I was ready to move to Los Angeles, he would see to it that I was taken care of until I was settled. I found a true friend and went back to Phoenix with a sense of security and newfound strength. I had a way out, and it was available to me whenever I was ready to take it. So, ladies, I don't know about this yet. I don't believe that you should tell any man anything that you have experienced with another man, especially if it is negative, because I feel like it's kind of an indicator of what you will accept, and I feel like it can set you up for failure. So be very, very careful what you tell men. And that is my word of wisdom. Moving on. Over the next 10 months, I stayed in Phoenix. I was determined to put my failed marriage and everything that had occurred before it behind me. Since G and I had been separated, I had moved into my own apartment and worked several odd jobs trying to make ends meet, including a stint as a car salesperson. I don't know why I found that funny, but that was like the last thing I would expect for her to say. I settled on taking a quick nurse's aid course and got placed in a nursing assistant position at a senior care hospital. Then, finally, I worked as an apartment leasing consultant. G, in the meantime, was in and out of town, living between New York and Arizona. As he worked to revitalize his career, he'd somewhat downgraded his lifestyle and no longer lived in the house we shared. Instead, he rented a 3-bedroom apartment in a Phoenix suburb and lived with his girlfriend Ashley, who he'd moved from New York. He also began to spend large amounts of money on diamond and platinum jewelry while I continued to struggle with our son. G and I ended up living about 4 blocks apart, so he'd stop by my apartment to see me and the baby. Never once did I think of going back. I did, however, think we could at least work together and do the right thing for our son. I was wrong. Eventually, I saved enough money to buy my first car, a Nissan Sentra. I was so excited that I called G to tell him. His first words were, "Why would you buy a car? Take it back. I'll buy you one later." Yeah, right. Yeah, right. The summers in Phoenix were scorching, with temperatures upwards of 120 degrees. Until I bought a car, I had been walking with my son to and from the grocery store while dodging 4 lanes of traffic. I had been wasting money on cabs or waiting for G to give me a ride whenever he was in town. In response to his telling me to take the car back, I simply told him I would and hung up the phone, knowing that G still didn't want the best for me or my son. I knew him well enough to know that he had no intention of buying me a car. He just wanted me to take the car back because he couldn't stand for me to be independent. Well, too late. I knew this car was going to be the best thing for me, and I would no longer allow him to dictate my life. Yes, girl. I called Ice to tell him about the car. He was happy for me. He was my support system, the only person in my life who was building me up, whereas everyone else seemed to be tearing me down. I began to no longer look for G's approval and counted on only Ice to be my guide. We would talk on the phone at least once a week. He sent money when I needed it and gave me advice, like only he could do. He told me there was no way I would make it in Phoenix and I needed to get to Los Angeles right away. He felt it was futile for him to continue sending me money in a place where I could never get ahead. True. Ice continually reassured me that I was meant to be something greater than I was. I was living in a 1-bedroom apartment with no furniture, and the money I made with my job barely paid the accumulating bills and childcare expenses. Not to mention the enormous amount of debt I took on once G left me with all the bills from the house. I was ready to go, and Ice was behind me all the way. It wasn't long before I filed papers at the local courthouse for regulated child support and shared custody, but it would prove to be a slow-moving process. G pitched in financially once in a while, but it was never seemed to be enough. I was in school and working part-time while G was living the high life, being the rap star he always wanted to be. Has anybody ever heard any of Kool G Rap's songs? Because I haven't. And are they any good? Anyway, I wanted the chance to start over too, in another city. It was my turn to get my life together. I was also angry because I had been doing all of the parenting by myself, and while G was getting his life back in order, I felt confined by our child. I just needed a break, a chance to grow and learn and be someone different, someone other than this needy woman I'd become. I wanted to be who I was before I met him, the confident, fearless, single me. There was just one thing I had to do before leaving Arizona: temporarily leave my son behind. Girl, I don't know how she does that, because my son's been gone for like 3 days because of the bloody COVID, and I miss him like crazy. So, more power to you, but I just couldn't. There was one thing I had to do before leaving Arizona: temporarily leave my son behind, just in case I was making the wrong move. And just in case I failed. I didn't want Naeem to fail with me. I wanted to be stable before bringing my son along. And although G and I had our problems, I knew he would never harm his son. While I'm not proud of the way I went about it, what I did sent me on the road to Los Angeles without my son. I drove the few blocks to G's apartment and arrived there just in time to see him getting into his car with a friend who was visiting from out of town. Impulsively, I sped up to the rear of G's car, and with a swift turn in the steering wheel, I blocked him in. My heart was pounding, and all the sounds around me became muted. I flung open my car door, jumped out, and opened the back passenger door. I took my 1-year-old son from his seat, grabbed his bag, and placed them both in the parking lot in front of G and his friend. And just as fast as I sped in, I hurried out before he could protest, and didn't stop until I hit the Hollywood city limits. Each of those 6 hours felt like 100 as I drove to Los Angeles. Ice had given me directions and reserved a suite for me in a hotel. I called him every hour to let him know the trip was going well. Along the way, I fantasized about what my new life would be like. I imagined the clothes and the cars. My mind travelled back to the women in the videos who I admired and imagined myself looking just like them. I was happy, but more importantly, I was focused. The journey ended at Franklin and Orchard Avenues in the heart of Hollywood. The street was dark and narrow, with a row of tiny hotels and tenements on each side. I took a deep breath before I entered the building. I was in shock. I pulled it off. I actually left it all behind. My old man, my old house, my old life, my new baby. I picked up the room key from the front desk. Once I was settled, there was a soft knock on the door and my heart seemed to skip 1,000 beats. I straightened my clothes, smoothed out my hair and took another deep breath. I flung the door as wide as it would go until it hit the adjacent wall. I jumped into Ice-T's arms and held on tight as I could. I smelled him, taking in every molecule. Ice and I spent almost every day together. I craved to be near him. I needed him. I needed Ice to teach me, to make me better, and to undo all of the awful things that had been done to me. Ice taught me a lot about how to make it in Los Angeles, where to eat, where to shop, how to negotiate, and how to know my worth professionally. He also taught me about the Hollywood nightlife. We frequented some of the hottest clubs in the city, yet it wasn't about dancing and partying. He observed. It was typical for us to grab a spot in a far right corner, always in position so Ice could see everyone who came and went and what they were doing. He usually wore a hat of some sort, sat with his legs crossed, appearing as if he was in deep thought. He rarely moved until it was time to go. On the nights when we stayed in, and there were many, Ice and I would just quietly lie together, enjoying each other's presence. Where's Coco? Sometimes we drove around in his black-on-black S600 Mercedes, and I held his hand. Ice taught me that I should never hold someone's hand completely, just the smallest finger. That would show that I'm not asking for all of him, just a small part. Ew, what kind of pimp shit is this? And from that day forward, I would hold his pinky finger and love that small part of him. Wow. Kareen, girl, where is your own mind? Girl. Ugh. We spent a lot of time at his office in Hollywood, where he had a pimp room, you see? The office was on the top floor of the building and it overlooked the city. The pimp room had oversized red velvet curtains and black leather sofas. There were few accessories that stood out. A giant pimptionary. A dictionary of pimp terminology. And a video camera set up on a tripod. In this room, we watched porn and made a few flicks of our own. When we were together, I felt like a woman. I was all his. I remember that first Christmas in Los Angeles. It fell on a Sunday, and he told his then long-time girlfriend and their young son that he was going to the bank or something. Oh, so Coco wasn't around at this point. He then came over and spent time with me so I wouldn't be alone. Wow. We both knew there was really no excuse for him not to be home on Christmas morning since everything was closed. But that never mattered to us. He operated in his own space and time. No one made Ice do anything he didn't want to do. When we made love, it was never sexual. Rather, it was like he was feeding me. With every slow, wet stroke, with every warm, sweet kiss, he gave me a piece of himself and let me know that he trusted and cared for me. I felt grown up, knowing I could please a man like that, a man with so many more years and experience than me. At those moments, I felt complete. And that is the end of chapter 8. Guys, the next chapter